They called her the Mole Woman. In the small settlement of Thornfield, Nebraska, where the prairie stretched flat and endless under skies so vast they made newcomers dizzy, Ingrid Holmberg had become something of a local curiosity. Not the good kind, not the kind that made people want to know you better, the kind that made them cross to the other side of the street, the kind that made mothers pull their children closer and whisper warnings about what grief could do to a person's mind. She was 34 years old in the autumn of 1883, though she looked older. Her face had been weathered by sun and wind, and something else, something that lived behind her eyes and never quite went away. Those eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, pale and knowing and touched with a sadness that seemed permanent. Her hands were calloused, her back permanently bent from work that most men would have abandoned after the first week. And every morning, before the sun had fully risen over the eastern horizon, she could be found at the edge of her property with a shovel in her hands, digging, always digging. While everyone else in Thornfield built their homes toward the sky, Ingrid Holmberg built hers into the earth. She had been at it for 2 years now, carving tunnels through the Nebraska soil like some kind of human prairie dog. The network spread beneath her modest homestead like the roots of a great tree, connecting her small cabin to her barn to her root cellar to her well house. 80 yards of tunnel completed. Another 100 planned. Her border collie, Odin, lay at the edge of the excavation, watching her work with the patient devotion that only a dog can offer. He was 6 years old now, his muzzle just beginning to show the first hints of gray. He had belonged to her husband once. Now he belonged to her, and he seemed to understand in that mysterious way dogs have that his job was to stay close, to keep watch, to never let her out of his sight. The sound of approaching hooves made Odin lift his head and growl softly. Ingrid did not stop digging. She knew who it would be. She had heard the laughter at the general store yesterday, the whispers that stopped when she walked in, the way Prudence Hendricks had said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that it was such a shame what grief could do to a woman's mind. Such a shame about those poor children, growing up with a mother who had clearly lost her senses. The hooves stopped. A shadow fell across the hole where Ingrid worked. Still at it, I see. Cyrus Blackwood sat atop his chestnut mare, looking down at her with the kind of expression that successful men reserve for those they consider beneath them. He was the wealthiest landowner in the county. 200 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, a 2-story house with glass windows shipped from Chicago, and a wife who wore dresses that had never known the rough kiss of a washboard. Ingrid continued shoveling dirt. "You know what they're calling you in town," Cyrus said. It was not a question. The Mole Woman, the crazy widow who digs holes in the ground instead of finding a new husband to take care of her and those 3 children. More dirt flew from the shovel. Odin's growl deepened, but Ingrid silenced him with a slight gesture of her hand. Cyrus leaned forward in his saddle. "I've lived in Nebraska for 23 years, Mrs. Holmberg. Built everything I have with these 2 hands. And I've never seen anyone waste their time on something so foolish as underground tunnels. What are you preparing for? An invasion of moles?" He laughed at his own joke. The sound echoed across the empty prairie, harsh and confident. Ingrid finally stopped digging. She looked up at him, and something in those winter sky eyes made his laughter die in his throat. There was no anger there, no defensiveness, just a certainty so absolute that it was almost unsettling. "You will see," she said quietly. Then she went back to digging. Cyrus Blackwood rode away shaking his head, already composing the story he would tell us at the general store. But Ingrid barely noticed his departure. She was counting again. She always counted when she dug. 1, 2, 3. Each shovelful of earth was a number. Each number was a step. Each step was the distance between life and death in a whiteout blizzard. 43. She stopped counting at 43. She always stopped at 43. That was the number of footsteps between the chicken coop and the front door of their farmhouse in Minnesota. She had paced it out afterward, in the days when she could still walk, when her legs had not yet betrayed her with their trembling. 43 steps. Her husband Tobias had walked that distance 1,000 times. Could have walked it blindfolded. Could have walked it in his sleep. But on that January night 3 years ago, 43 steps had been the distance between life and death. The memory came whether she wanted it or not. It always came when she was digging. The storm had not seemed dangerous when Tobias pulled on his coat. Just a little snow, he had said. Just a quick check on the chickens. They had lost 2 hens to a fox the week before, and he wanted to make sure the coop was secure. Ingrid had been nursing baby Astrid by the fire, their son Soren reading aloud from a primer to his younger sister Rosalind. A perfect winter evening, the kind of evening that made you grateful for walls and warmth and family. "Be back in 5 minutes," Tobias had said, bending to kiss her forehead. His beard had tickled her skin. His eyes had been warm with love. Those were the last words he ever spoke to her. The blizzard hit like a fist. One moment the snow was falling gently, almost peacefully. The next moment the world turned white. Not white like snow, but white like blindness. White like the inside of a cloud. White like death wearing a friendly mask. Ingrid heard Tobias calling. She ran to the door, threw it open, and was nearly knocked backward by the force of the wind. Snow filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She could not see her hand in front of her face. "Tobias!" The wind swallowed her voice. "Tobias!" She tried to step outside, but the wall of screaming white pushed her back. She could hear him calling somewhere out there in the shrieking darkness. But the sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. She took 1 step, 2 steps. The wind spun her around. Suddenly, she did not know which direction was which. The doorframe was gone. The house was gone. Everything was gone except the endless, howling white. Strong hands grabbed her. Soren, only 12 years old, had followed her to the door. He pulled her back inside and she fought him, screaming Tobias's name. But he held on with a strength she did not know he possessed. "You'll die, Mama! You can't see anything out there." They huddled by the door all night, listening for a voice that grew fainter and fainter until it finally stopped altogether. Rosalind held baby Astrid, her 8-year-old face pale with terror. Odin paced and whined, scratching at the door, trying to reach his master. When the storm cleared the next morning, they found Tobias 43 steps from the front door. 43 steps. His arm was outstretched, reaching toward the house. His fingers were frozen in a grasping position, as if he had been trying to touch something that was almost within reach. Almost. So close that if Ingrid had known which direction to walk, she could have touched him from the porch. She had to use warm water to remove the wedding ring from his frozen finger. The metal was so cold it burned her skin, but she had kept that ring, and she wore it now on a chain around her neck, next to her heart. 43 steps. 43 steps. That was the distance between Tobias and survival. In a whiteout blizzard, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. You can stand 10 feet from your front door and die lost. You can call for help and have your voice swallowed by wind. You can be so close to safety that your fingertips almost brush the doorframe and still die reaching for it. Ingrid never forgot that number. She carried it with her every day, counting steps, counting heartbeats, counting the distance between here and there. And she made a promise to herself, standing over her husband's frozen body while her children sobbed behind her. No one in her family would ever die reaching for a door they could not find. No one would ever count those steps again. But promises made in grief are heavy things to carry, and sometimes the only way to carry them is to dig. The bank took the farm 3 months after Tobias died. Ingrid could not make the payments, not with 3 children and no husband, not with a Minnesota winter that had killed half the livestock and frozen the ground too hard to bury the dead. The banker had been apologetic, in that way that men are apologetic when they are about to do something cruel but profitable. "It's nothing personal, Mrs. Holmberg, just business." She sold what little remained. The furniture that had been her mother's, the tools that had been Tobias's father's, the wedding dress she had been saving for Rosalind. Everything went piece by piece, memory by memory, until all she had left was 3 children, a border collie, a small pouch of coins, and her grandfather's journal. The journal was the one thing she refused to sell. Magnus Holmberg had been a mining supervisor in Røros, Norway, in the days before Ingrid's father had emigrated to America. He had spent 30 years underground, and he had written everything down. The temperature at different depths, the way to shore up a tunnel so it would not collapse, the secret that miners had known for centuries. that below the frost line, below the reach of winter's fingers, the Earth maintained a constant temperature, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, summer and winter, blizzard and drought. Above the ground, the temperature could swing 100 degrees in a single year. But 6 feet down in the belly of the Earth, it was always 54 degrees. Underground, Magnus had written in his careful Norwegian script, "Winter does not exist." Ingrid read those words on the train to Nebraska while her children slept against her shoulders and the prairie scrolled past the window like an endless brown ocean. She had chosen Nebraska because land was cheap and because it was far from Minnesota, far from the farm, far from the grave where Tobias lay. But she was not running away. She was preparing. She bought 40 acres of flat Nebraska land with the last of her money. It was not much, a small cabin with a leaking roof, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a chicken coop that looked like it would blow away in the first strong wind. The neighbors came to welcome her, as neighbors do. They brought bread and preserves and advice about surviving the Nebraska winters. They told her about the blizzards that swept down from Canada, about the way the temperature could drop 50 degrees in an hour, about the settlers who had died walking from their barns to their houses. Ingrid listened. She thanked them for their kindness. And the next morning, she started digging. The first tunnel took 3 months. It connected her cabin to the barn. 80 yards of packed earth reinforced with cottonwood beams every 4 feet. She dug alone at first because she could not afford to hire help and because Soren was too young for such heavy work. Her hands blistered and bled. Her back ached so badly some nights that she could not sleep. But every morning before the sun rose, she was back in the earth. The neighbors noticed, of course. In a small settlement like Thornfield, everyone noticed everything. What's the widow digging out there? Something about tunnels. Can you imagine? Tunnels? What on earth for? Lord knows, they say grief affects people differently. Some take to drink, some take to religion, and some, apparently, take to digging holes in the ground. The whispers reached Ingrid's ears, as whispers always do. She ignored them. She had learned in those terrible days after Tobias died that other people's opinions could not hurt her. Only the cold could hurt her, only the distance between here and there, only 43 steps. By the end of the first year, she had completed 3 tunnels. Cabin to barn, barn to root cellar to well house, a total of 200 yards of underground passage, all of it 6 feet deep, all of it carefully shored up with timber, all of it lit by oil lanterns at every junction. The skeptics continued to mock her. She's gone completely mad, building her own grave before she's even dead. What kind of example is that for those poor children? But Ingrid kept digging, and slowly, quietly, some of her neighbors began to pay attention. Corlin Prescott was the first to really understand. She came on a September afternoon when the prairie grass had turned gold and the first hints of autumn were in the air. Her husband Everett had told her not to bother, had said that the Holmberg woman was crazy and it would only encourage her. But Coraline had always been curious, and there was something about the way Ingrid worked, something about the determined set of her shoulders, that made Coraline want to know more. "May I see them?" she asked, standing at the edge of the excavation where Ingrid was digging. "The tunnels?" Ingrid looked up. Most people came to mock, not to ask. There was something different in this woman's eyes, something like genuine interest. "Come," Ingrid said. She led Coraline into the earth. The temperature change was immediate and remarkable. Above ground, the September sun beat down with surprising heat, but in the tunnel, the air was cool and still, like stepping into a spring house. The walls were packed earth, smooth and solid, reinforced every 4 feet with thick cottonwood beams. Oil lanterns hung at regular intervals, their gentle light casting warm shadows. "It's like another world," Coraline whispered. "It is another world," Ingrid replied. "Above ground, winter kills. Below ground, winter cannot touch you." She told Coraline about Tobias then. The first time she had told anyone the whole story. The storm that came without warning. The 43 steps. The frozen hand reaching for a door that was so close. So impossibly close. Coraline wept. She took Ingrid's calloused hands in her own and held them. And she wept for a man she had never met and a grief she could only imagine. I understand now, she said. This isn't madness. This is love. One person believed. One woman looked past the whispers and the laughter and saw the truth underneath. Sometimes that is all it takes to keep going when the whole world thinks you are crazy. A single person who says, I see you, I understand, you are not alone. Coraline Prescott became that person for Ingrid Holmberg. And from that moment, everything began to change. But one believer in a settlement of skeptics was still a very small number. And the winter was coming. The real winter. The kind that would test everything Ingrid had built. Convincing Everett Prescott was harder. He was a practical man, slow to trust, wary of anything that seemed too different. When Coraline came home talking about tunnels and underground passages and connecting their homestead to the widow's network, he shook his head. People will think we've lost our minds too. Let them think what they want. It's not that simple. Cyrus Blackwood already thinks I'm soft for letting you visit her. If I start digging tunnels, he'll never let me hear the end of it. Cyrus Blackwood is a fool. Everett looked at his wife in surprise. Coraline rarely spoke harshly about anyone. That woman lost her husband 43 steps from her front door, Coraline continued. 43 steps, Everett. He was so close she could have touched him from the porch and she couldn't find him in the white. She couldn't save him because she couldn't see him. Now she's making sure that never happens again. Not to her, not to her children, not to anyone who's willing to listen. The storms here aren't that bad. Tell that to the 14 people who died in 1856. The voice came from the corner of the room. Old Silas, Coraline's father, had been sitting quietly by the fire. He was 82 years old, his memory sometimes uncertain, but on this subject he was absolutely clear. The storm of 1856, he said again. I was 25 years old, thought I knew everything, thought I was immortal the way young men do. He paused, his rheumy eyes growing distant with memory. 14 people died in this settlement that day. 14, I survived it because I crawled into the Petersons' root cellar and stayed there for 3 days. When I came out, the world had changed. Bodies everywhere, frozen solid, some of them only a few feet from their doors. Silas looked at his son-in-law with the weight of 82 years in his gaze. That Norwegian woman is right. She's the first person in 30 years who understands what's coming. Let her dig. Everett was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right, she can dig. The Prescott Tunnel was completed by the end of October 1883. It stretched a quarter mile from Ingrid's network to the Prescott homestead, passing beneath fields and fence lines, connecting two families in a web of earth and timber. Other families followed. The Novaks, Polish immigrants who recognized the technique from their homeland. Old Garrett Hensley, who had spent 30 years in the coal mines of Cornwall and knew good tunnel work when he saw it. By November, 5 homesteads were connected, 400 yards of underground passage, with another 200 in progress. But not everyone was convinced. Cyrus Blackwood remained the loudest skeptic. He had the ear of the town council and the respect that came with wealth, and he made sure everyone knew his opinion. Digging holes like a bunch of gophers, he said at the general store one afternoon, loud enough for Ingrid to hear as she purchased her monthly supplies. What's next? Living in caves? Going backwards to when we were primitives? The other men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. I've survived 23 Nebraska winters without hiding underground like a frightened rabbit, Cyrus continued. Real men face the weather. Real men don't run and hide. Ingrid picked up her purchases and turned to face him. The store went quiet. What will you do, she asked calmly, when the whiteout comes? When you cannot see your hand in front of your face? When your son is 40 feet from the barn and you cannot find him? Cyrus's face reddened. That won't happen. It happened to my husband. He was 43 steps from our door. That was Minnesota. This is Nebraska. It's different here. Ingrid shook her head slowly. Weather does not care about state lines, Mr. Blackwood. The cold comes for everyone. The only question is whether you are prepared. She walked out before he could respond, Odin padding faithfully at her heels. That night, Jasper Blackwood came to her cabin. He was 23 years old, Cyrus's only son, tall and broad-shouldered, with his father's dark hair, but his mother's gentler eyes. He came after dark, when no one would see, and he stood in the shadows as if afraid to step into the light. I believe you, he said quietly. I've always believed you, since the first time I heard about the tunnels. Ingrid studied him. Then why come at night? Why hide? My father would disown me if he knew. He's already angry that I even speak to you in town. Jasper shook his head, frustration and helplessness warring in his expression. I've tried to convince him, but he won't listen. He's too proud. He thinks admitting you might be right would mean admitting he was wrong about everything. And you, what do you think? Jasper was silent for a long moment. Then, I think I should learn to dig. Ingrid looked at him, at this young man caught between duty to his father and certainty in his heart. She saw herself in him in a way, the knowing, the helplessness of knowing and being unable to act. Then learn, she said gently, and when the time comes, maybe you can help him understand. But Jasper shook his head. He'll never allow a tunnel on his property, never. He'd see it as weakness. Then I hope you can find your way home in a whiteout, Ingrid said quietly, because someday, Mr. Blackwood, a storm is coming that will not care about your father's pride. Jasper stood there for a moment longer, caught between two worlds. Then he nodded once and disappeared into the darkness. Odin watched him go, his tail not wagging. November 17th, 1883, dawned warm and golden. The temperature climbed to 55 degrees by noon, remarkable for mid-November. Children ran outside without coats. Housewives hung laundry and marveled at the weather. Even the skeptics smiled and said that maybe this would be an easy winter after all. Ingrid knew better. She had seen skies like this before, felt air like this before. The warmth was wrong, too sudden, too gentle. The prairie had a particular color when false weather arrived, and she saw it now in the pale quality of the light, in the way the horizon shimmered like something alive. Stay close today, she told Soren that morning. Don't go far. The Prescotts need help with their fence, Ma, I promised Declan. Go then, but stay near the house, and if the wind changes, get underground immediately. Do not try to walk home. Use the tunnel. Soren rolled his eyes the way 15-year-old boys do when their mothers worry too much. But he agreed. Rosalind and Astrid stayed home, helping with chores. At 11, Rosalind had taken on much of the household work, cooking and cleaning with a quiet competence that sometimes made Ingrid's heart ache. She should have been playing, should have been carefree. Instead, she was becoming a woman before her time, shaped by loss and responsibility. Astrid at 7 still had her childhood. She chased chickens and talked to Odin and asked endless questions about everything. But even she had learned to read her mother's moods, to recognize when worry clouded those winter sky eyes. Odin lay on the porch, unusually restless. He kept whining softly, staring at the northern horizon as if he saw something no one else could see. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind shifted. Ingrid felt it before she saw it, a sudden chill that raised goosebumps on her arms, followed by a strange silence as the birds stopped, singing all at once. The chickens, who had been scratching peacefully in the yard, suddenly ran for the coop. Odin rose to his feet, hackles raised, a low growl building in his throat. She looked north, and her breath caught in her throat. A wall of cloud was rolling toward them. Not a normal storm front, something else entirely. Something alive and malevolent, black as coal and boiling with fury, moving faster than anything natural should move. It devoured the sky as she watched, swallowing the sun, transforming the golden afternoon into premature twilight. Ingrid had seen this once before, 3 years ago in Minnesota. Rosalind! Astrid! Get inside now! The girls came running from the garden, their faces confused. The sky had been clear just moments ago. What's wrong, Mama? No time underground, now. They barely made it. The wind hit like a locomotive, slamming the cabin door so hard the hinges screamed. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 3 minutes. And then the snow came. Not falling snow, horizontal snow, driven by wind that shrieked like something alive and furious. Ingrid grabbed the lantern and the emergency supplies she always kept ready. She pushed her daughters toward the pantry, where a trap door led to the tunnel system. Odin was already there, whining urgently, pawing at the floor. But Soren, Rosalind cried, he's at the Prescotts. Ingrid's heart stopped. Her son, her firstborn, a quarter mile away. She ran to the window, but there was nothing to see. Solid white, impenetrable. A wall of screaming white that swallowed everything, that had killed her husband, that was now standing between her and her son. For a terrible moment, she considered running after him, considered plunging into that howling white and searching until she found him or died trying. Rosalind grabbed her arm with both hands, pulling back with all her 11-year-old strength. Mama, no, you'll die like Papa. You told us. You made us promise that we would never run into a whiteout. You made us promise. Now you have to keep your own promise. The words hit Ingrid like a slap. Her own words thrown back at her by her daughter. The promise she had extracted from her children. The promise that had kept them alive in Minnesota. The tunnel, Astrid said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the panic. The tunnel goes to the Prescotts, Mama. Soren can come through the tunnel. Ingrid looked at her youngest daughter, and something shifted in her chest. Of course, the tunnel. She had dug it for exactly this moment. Not to hide from storms, but to reach through them. To connect when the surface world became impassable. Underground, she said, her voice steadier now. Everyone underground. If Soren is at the Prescotts, they'll use the tunnel. They'll come to us. She led her daughters into the earth. The tunnel was dark except for the oil lanterns at each junction, but Ingrid knew every twist and turn by heart. 6 feet below the surface, the storm was nothing but a distant rumble, like thunder from another world. Down here, the air was cool and still. 54 degrees, the temperature of survival. They gathered in the wide-in chamber where several tunnels met, a space Ingrid had carved out specifically for emergencies. Large enough for a dozen people, stocked with blankets, water, and preserved food. And then they waited. Ingrid tried not to count the minutes, tried not to think about Soren out there in the white, tried to trust that he would remember the tunnel, that the Prescotts would know what to do. Rosalind sat against the earthen wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was trying to be brave, trying not to show her fear, but Ingrid could see the trembling in her shoulders. Astrid curled against her mother's side, not understanding why the adults were so frightened. Odin lay across Ingrid's feet, his warm weight the only comfort in the darkness. Ingrid counted despite herself. 1, 2, 3, each heartbeat a footstep. Each footstep 43. 20 minutes passed, 30, an hour. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, footsteps, running footsteps. Ingrid grabbed the lantern and held it high, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. If it was Soren, he would be coming from the east tunnel, the one that connected to the Prescotts. She stared into the darkness, waiting, barely breathing. A figure emerged from the shadows. Soren, covered in dirt, his face pale, his clothes muddy from crawling through the tunnel. But alive, whole, here. Ingrid dropped the lantern and ran to him. She grabbed him so hard she nearly knocked him over, and she held on like she would never let go. Mama, you're safe, Istrid. I'm sorry I didn't listen this morning. When the storm came, I was outside, I was helping with the fence, and I couldn't see anything, I couldn't see the house. But you remembered the tunnel. Soren nodded against her shoulder. Mr. Prescott remembered. He grabbed me and pulled me toward the root cellar, and then we went through the tunnel and he pulled back suddenly, his face stricken. Mama, Mr. Prescott and Declan. They weren't at the house when the storm hit. They were out in the south field, 2 miles away. They're still out there. Behind Soren, the rest of the Prescott family was emerging from the tunnel. Coraline, her face streaked with tears. Old Silas, moving slowly but steadily. Phineas, just 12 years old, clinging to his mother's hand. But Everett and Declan were not with them. They'll find shelter, Ingrid said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. They'll dig in. They'll survive. Coraline shook her head, tears streaming down her face. 2 miles. In this storm, how can they possibly? They're smart men. They know the land. They'll find something. But Ingrid was counting again. Counting footsteps. Counting 43 over and over. The distance between life and death in a whiteout. Underground, one family was reunited. Above ground, 2 men were fighting for their lives in a storm that could kill in minutes. The distance between safety and death was not measured in miles. It was measured in preparation, in knowledge, in the decision made years before to dig tunnels that everyone said were crazy. Ingrid had saved her son, but could she save everyone? And somewhere at the Blackwood homestead, where no tunnel had ever been dug, Jasper Blackwood was looking out a window at the white death surrounding him. He was thinking about the widow's words. Someday a storm is coming that will not care about your father's pride. That day had arrived. By nightfall, 23 people were sheltering in Ingrid's tunnel network. They came one by one and family by family, emerging from the connecting passages with lanterns and blankets and faces that showed equal measures of terror and relief. The Novaks arrived carrying their last loaves of bread and a precious jar of preserved fruit. Old Garrett Hensley and his son Elijah came through the eastern tunnel, both of them shaken and white-faced. "We were in the barn when it hit," Elijah said, his voice trembling. "We tried to make it to the house, but the second we stepped outside, we couldn't see anything. Nothing. Just white. We would have frozen if Father hadn't remembered the tunnel." Old Garrett, 72 years old and moving with the care of a man whose body had outlived his expectations, sat down heavily on a pile of blankets. 30 years in the Cornwall mines," he said. 30 years underground. And I never thought I'd use that knowledge again." He looked at Ingrid with new respect in his tired eyes. "You saved our lives, Mrs. Holmberg." "The tunnel saved your lives," Ingrid replied. "I just dug it." Same thing. More arrivals, more reunions, more tears of relief, the underground chamber filled with people and warmth and the sound of voices. Someone lit additional lanterns. Someone else distributed blankets. A sense of community began to form in the darkness, strangers and neighbors becoming something more. Rosalind had taken charge of the younger children without being asked. At 11, she understood the danger, but still believed in her mother's tunnels. She organized the Novak children and the smaller ones into a corner, telling them stories to keep them calm. Stories about Norway, about underground kingdoms, about brave people who survived impossible winters. They were her mother's stories, the ones Ingrid had told her on cold Minnesota nights. Now Rosalind passed them on, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. "Your daughter has your strength," Magda Novak said quietly to Ingrid, watching Rosalind comfort a crying toddler. "She will be a leader someday." Ingrid looked at her middle child, this girl who rarely spoke but always watched, who absorbed everything and understood more than she said. "She already is," Ingrid replied. 23 people, 3 dings. One cat that had somehow followed the Peterson widow underground and now sat in her lap purring as if nothing unusual was happening. Above them, the storm raged. They could hear it even down here, a constant low rumble like the earth itself was growling. Every so often the timber supports creaked and groaned, reminding them that their sanctuary was not indestructible. But for now, they were alive. Magda Novak was the first to do something practical. She pulled out her bread dough, which she had somehow thought to grab in her flight to the tunnel, and began kneading it on a flat stone. "We will need food," she said in her accented English. "Storm like this, who knows how long it lasts? I make bread." Her husband Joseph sat beside her, his face gray and his breathing labored. He had a weak heart, everyone knew, and the run to the tunnel had exhausted him. But he was alive. That was what mattered. Someone started singing, an old hymn, one of those songs everyone knows even if they cannot remember where they learned it. Other voices joined in, hesitant at first, then stronger. The earthen walls made the music round and warm, and for a few minutes people forgot to be afraid. Ingrid moved through the tunnel network, checking supports, monitoring the ventilation shafts, making sure the lanterns had enough oil. Soren walked with her, and she saw in his face a new understanding. "You were right, Mama," he said quietly. "About everything. I'm sorry I ever doubted you. I'm sorry I was ashamed." Ingrid stopped walking. She took her son's face in her hands, this boy who had grown so tall, who had held her back from death 3 years ago in Minnesota. "You saved me once," she said, "when your father died. I would have run into that storm, and I would have died too. You pulled me back. You were 12 years old, and you saved my life." She kissed his forehead. "Never apologize for doubting. Just remember that doubt and trust can live in the same heart." The first crisis came at midnight. Joseph Novak collapsed against the tunnel wall, clutching his chest, his face the color of ash. His wife screamed. People came running from all directions, their lanterns casting wild shadows on the earthen walls. His heart, Magda sobbed. He has medicine for his heart, but it is at home. In the cabinet by the bed, the brown bottle. Ingrid calculated distances in her head. The Novak homestead was connected to the network, but it was the farthest connection, nearly 300 yards through the twisting tunnels. And above ground, the storm still raged. The tunnel, she said. We go through the tunnel. She grabbed a lantern and ran. Elijah Hensley followed, his younger legs keeping pace despite his lingering fear. They navigated the dark passages by memory and instinct, counting junctions, turning left and right until the tunnel opened into the Novak root cellar. The medicine was where Magda had said it would be. A small brown bottle with a handwritten label. Ingrid grabbed it and ran back, her lungs burning, her legs screaming with the effort. 8 minutes. That was how long it took to reach Joseph, to put the pills in his shaking hand, to watch the color slowly return to his face as the medicine did its work. 8 minutes. If there had been no tunnel, Joseph Novak would be dead. There was no doctor for 20 miles, no way to reach the house through the storm, no way to get the medicine that was keeping his heart beating. Old Garrett said it aloud, his voice carrying to every corner of the underground network. That tunnel just saved his life. We couldn't have reached that medicine any other way, not in this storm. We would have just watched him die. People looked at Ingrid with new eyes, not as the mole woman, not as the crazy widow who dug holes in the ground, as something else, something they did not have a word for yet. The second crisis came at 3 in the morning, and it was worse than the first. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the tunnels, then another, then a grinding, groaning noise that made everyone freeze. The supports, Ingrid whispered, the eastern section. She ran before anyone could stop her, lantern in hand, Soren close behind. What she found made her stomach drop. 3 of the main support beams had cracked. The packed earth above them was bulging downward, held back only by the remaining timber. Dirt trickled through the gaps like sand through an hourglass. Each trickle was a warning. Each grain was borrowed time. The frost, Ingrid said, her voice tight with fear. It's reaching deeper than I calculated. The frozen ground is expanding, pressing down on the supports. Can we fix it? We have to try. They worked frantically, Ingrid and Soren and Elijah Hensley, hauling spare timber from the storage alcove, wedging new supports beneath the failing beams. The work was desperate and dangerous. Every time Ingrid had hammered a new beam into place, she half expected the ceiling to collapse on top of her. An hour passed, 2 hours. The immediate danger was contained, but the damage was done. 3 major supports had failed. The eastern tunnel was now held together by emergency bracing that might last a day or might last an hour. 23 lives depending on timber and packed earth and the desperate work of 3 exhausted people. Ingrid found herself in the deepest part of the tunnel, away from the others. She sat with her back against the cold earth and finally let herself feel it. The fear, the doubt, the crushing weight of responsibility. She had been so certain. She had dug for 2 years, had planned every detail, had checked and rechecked every beam, and still the tunnel was failing. Maybe she wasn't good enough. Maybe she had been fooling herself all along. Maybe everyone who called her crazy had been right. Odin found her there, as he always did. He nuzzled her hand with his cold nose and lay down with his head on her lap, his warm weight the only comfort in the darkness. I did everything right, Ingrid whispered, her voice breaking. I dug deep. I used good timber. I planned for everything. The tears came now, the first tears she had shed since Tobias died. They ran down her face and fell onto Odin's fur. And it still might not be enough. They might still die down here, because of me, because I wasn't good enough. She wept in the darkness, this woman who had been so strong for so long. She wept for Tobias. She wept for Jasper Blackwood, who was probably already dead in the snow above. She wept for every soul in these tunnels who had trusted her to keep them safe. A small hand touched her shoulder. Mama? Astrid, 7 years old, standing in the darkness with her own small lantern, her face serious and full of concern. Why are you crying? Ingrid tried to wipe her eyes, but the tears kept coming. Because I'm scared, sweetheart. I'm scared I can't keep everyone safe. Astrid sat down beside her mother, arranging her skirt carefully on the cold ground. She was quiet for a moment, thinking in that way children do when they are wrestling with something too big for words. "You told me something once," she said finally. "You said that being scared and being brave are the same thing. You said brave people aren't the ones who don't feel fear. They're the ones who feel fear and keep going anyway." "I said that?" "Yes, when I was scared of the dark." Astrid took her mother's hand in her small one. "Mama, everyone out there is scared. Mrs. Prescott is scared. Mr. Novak is scared, but they're still helping each other. They're still singing songs and making bread and telling stories. They're still being brave." She looked up at her mother with those serious eyes. "You can be scared and still be brave. You can cry and still keep going." Something shifted in Ingrid's chest. She looked at her youngest daughter, this child who had been born into grief and raised in tunnels, and had somehow grown wise beyond her years. "When did you get so smart?" "I'm 7, Astrid said, as if that explained everything. Ingrid laughed through her tears. It was a small laugh, broken and wet, but it was real. She pulled her daughter close and held her, and Odin pressed against them both, and for a moment the three of them sat in the darkness together. Then Ingrid stood up. She wiped her eyes. She took a deep breath. "You're right," she said. "Let's go be brave." They went back to work. While Ingrid and her neighbors survived underground, a different story was unfolding a quarter-mile away. Cyrus Blackwood's fine 2-story house had no tunnel. When the storm hit, Jasper had been in the far barn, tending to a pregnant mare. His father and mother were in the house, looking out the windows at the impossible wall of white that had swallowed the world in minutes. Jasper tried to make it back. They heard him calling, through the shriek of the wind, through the thunder of snow against the windows. They heard his voice, crying out for help, calling for his father, calling for anyone. Cordelia Blackwood ran to the door. Cyrus grabbed her, held her back. "You can't. You'll die out there." My son is out there. And if you go after him, I'll lose you both." They compromised, the desperate compromise of people with no good options. Cordelia tied a rope around her waist, with Cyrus holding the other end. She would walk as far as the rope allowed, calling for Jasper, and Cyrus would pull her back if she got into trouble. She made it 30 yards into the white, 30 yards of blindness, 30 yards of screaming her son's name into a wind that threw her words back in her face, 30 yards of reaching, grasping, finding nothing but empty air and stinging snow. When Cyrus pulled her back, her hands were already turning dark with frostbite, and Jasper's voice, which had been calling from somewhere out there in the darkness, had gone silent. "No," Cordelia whispered. "No, no, no." Cyrus stood at the window all night, staring into the white, listening for a voice that never came again. 2 houses, 2 families, 1 storm. Under one roof, people sang hymns and shared bread and helped each other shore up a collapsing tunnel. Under another roof, a father stood at a window and listened to his son die. The distance between them was not measured in yards or miles. It was measured in the decisions made months and years before. Ingrid had dug tunnels. Cyrus had laughed at her. And now, in the howling darkness, both of them were learning the cost of their choices. Pride is a heavy thing to carry, and sometimes the price of carrying it is more than any person should have to pay. The storm broke at dawn on November 18th. Not gently. Blizzards never do anything gently. But it broke. The wind dropped from a shriek to a howl to a moan, and finally to silence. The snow changed from horizontal to merely heavy, and then stopped altogether. And most importantly, visibility improved from nothing to something, and then to something more. It was enough. Ingrid led the first rescue party to the surface. The world that greeted them was unrecognizable. Snow drifted 10 feet high in some places, sculpted by the wind into alien shapes that bore no resemblance to anything human. Everything was buried. Fences had vanished. Barns were nothing but white mounds. The familiar landmarks of the prairie had been erased and replaced with something cold and foreign and strange. The silence was the strangest part. After 18 hours of howling wind, the stillness felt wrong. Holy, almost. As if the storm had exhausted itself and now the land was holding its breath, waiting to see what had survived. Odin ran ahead, his nose to the ground. He had always been good at finding things. Now in the aftermath of the storm, that skill took on a terrible importance. They found Everett and Declan Prescott first, alive, barely. They had hollowed out a snow cave beneath an overturned wagon, huddling together through the long night, sharing body heat, fighting off the cold that wanted to kill them. When the rescue party dug them out, they could barely move. Their lips were blue, their fingers and toes possibly frostbitten. But they were breathing. They were alive. Coraline collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing with relief. For a moment, everyone forgot about everything else. The survival felt like a miracle. But Odin was still running. He had found something else. They found Jasper Blackwood 30 yards from the barn. 30 yards. He lay face down in the snow, one arm extended toward the distant shape of the house, his fingers curled as if trying to grip the air itself. The pose was achingly familiar. Ingrid had seen it before 3 years ago in Minnesota. A different body, a different storm. The same desperate reach for safety that was so close and yet impossibly far. Ingrid stood over his body and the years fell away. She was in Minnesota again. She was looking at Tobias. She was counting steps. 43 steps for Tobias, 30 yards for Jasper. Different numbers, same story. The story of people who died within sight of safety, killed not by the cold itself, but by the blindness, by the white, by the distance that seemed so small when you could see and became infinite when you could not. He came to me, Ingrid said quietly, her voice thick with grief, a few weeks ago, at night, so his father wouldn't know. He said he believed me about the tunnels. He wanted to learn to dig. Soren stood beside her, looking at the frozen body of the young man who was only 8 years older than himself. Then why didn't he? His father wouldn't allow it. He was afraid of what people would think. Soren was quiet for a long moment. Then, he died because of pride. He died because of a storm, Ingrid corrected gently. The pride just made sure he had nowhere to go. Bringing the news to Cyrus Blackwood was one of the hardest things Ingrid had ever done. She walked a quarter mile to his house alone, through snow that came up to her waist in places. When she knocked on the door, she could hear sobbing inside. Cordelia's voice, raw with grief. Cyrus opened the door. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. He looked like a man who had not slept, who had not eaten, who had spent the night dying a little bit at a time. He knew. Before Ingrid said a word, he knew. Where? His voice was barely a whisper. 30 yards from the barn. Cyrus made a sound that was not quite human, a moan or a cry or something older and deeper than language. He was trying to get home, Ingrid continued, her own voice thick with tears. He was so close. Cyrus's legs gave out. He collapsed right there in the doorway, and Ingrid caught him. She held him while he sobbed. This man who had called her crazy, who had laughed at her tunnels, who had forbidden his son from learning to dig. She held him because that was what you did, because grief did not care about old arguments, because in the end, everyone who lost a child to the cold was part of the same terrible family. I was wrong, Cyrus gasped between sobs. I was wrong about everything. I called you a fool while you were building the only thing that could have saved him. The storm killed Jasper, Ingrid said softly, not you. My pride killed him. I wouldn't listen. I wouldn't let him listen. There was nothing to say to that. Nothing that would make it better. So Ingrid just held him and let him cry. When the tears finally slowed, Cyrus pulled back and looked at her with hollow eyes. Teach me, he said. Teach me to dig. Teach me to dig. 3 words that cost everything to speak. Cyrus Blackwood had spent years building his pride, his reputation, his certainty that he knew better than a Norwegian widow with a shovel. Now he knelt in the snow, asking that same widow to teach him. Some lessons can only be learned through loss. Some doors only open after tragedy has broken them down. But here is the question that matters. How many of us are waiting for our own tragedy before we are willing to learn? How many of us could pick up a shovel today, could prepare for the storms we know are coming, but choose pride instead? The ground is always there, waiting to be dug. The only question is whether we start before the storm or after. The aftermath of the blizzard brought a reckoning to Thornfield. 47 people died across 4 counties. Houses collapsed under the weight of snow. Livestock froze in barns. Entire families were found huddled together, the children in the middle, the parents wrapped around them in a final futile attempt at protection. But in Ingrid's tunnel network, everyone survived. 23 people, 3 dogs, 1 cat, and Joseph Novak, whose heart medicine had arrived through underground passages while the surface world was a death sentence. The skeptics came, one by one, to apologize. Dr. Pemberton arrived first, his medical bag in hand, his eyes cast down in shame. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about the health risks, about everything." 23 people lived underground for 18 hours, and not one of them got sick. The tunnels saved Joseph Novak's life when I couldn't have reached him through the storm. He shook his head. "I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to be a man of science. But you understood something I didn't. Something about how to keep people alive." Wyatt Tanner came next, the young man who had bet $5 that the tunnels would collapse before Christmas. He had nearly died himself, trying to walk 50 feet from the saloon to his boarding house. "I owe you $5, he said, his face red with shame. "And I owe you an apology. I got lost in 50 feet, Mrs. Holmberg. 50 feet. I was walking in circles until someone found me." He looked at the ground. "Can you teach me to dig?" Even Prudence Hendricks, the woman who had called Ingrid crazy loud enough for everyone to hear, came to pay her respects. She did not speak. She only stood at the tunnel entrance, looked into the earth, and nodded once. It was not much, but it was something. Ingrid accepted the apologies without gloating. She had never wanted to be right. She had only wanted to be safe. There was no satisfaction in being proven correct by a dead body frozen 30 yards from a barn. Spring came slowly to Thornfield. The snow melted in stages, revealing the damage beneath. Fences that needed repair, roofs that had partially collapsed, fields that would need replanting, and everywhere people dug. Cyrus Blackwood worked beside Ingrid every day. He was not a young man, and his body was not accustomed to hard labor. But he dug with a determination that bordered on desperation, as if he could somehow undo the past by preparing for the future. "This is where the main junction will be," Ingrid explained, showing him the plans. "From here, tunnels will branch out to every homestead that wants to connect. Eventually, the whole settlement will be linked." Cyrus nodded. "How long will it take?" "Years, but we have years. We have time now between storms. The important thing is to start." They worked in silence for a while. Then Cyrus spoke again. "Why did you help me after everything I said, after the way I treated you?" Ingrid stopped shoveling. She considered the question carefully. "Because I lost my husband to a storm," she said finally. "And I know what it feels like to stand over someone you love and wish you had done something different. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone, not even on someone who laughed at me." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You're a better person than I am." "No, I'm just a person who has already learned what you're learning now. That's all. We're just at different points on the same path." 20 years later, 1903, Ingrid Holmberg stood at the entrance of the original tunnel, the one she had dug alone all those years ago. She was 54 years old now, her hair gone silver, her back permanently curved from decades of digging. But those winter sky eyes were still sharp, still seeing storms before they arrived. So much had changed. The tunnel network had grown to cover the entire settlement, more than 3 miles of underground passages connecting 40 homesteads. After the blizzard of 1884, the town council had officially endorsed the system, and families that had once mocked the mole woman now competed to connect their homes to the network. Her children had grown up and gone into the world, carrying pieces of her with them. Soren, now 35, had become a mining engineer. He designed underground systems for communities across Nebraska and Wyoming, saving lives that no one would ever count because the disasters that would have killed them never happened. Rosalind, 31, had married a farmer from Omaha. She insisted that her new home have a tunnel before they moved in, much to her husband's initial confusion and eventual respect. She had 3 children of her own now, and she told them stories about their grandmother, about the woman who had dug tunnels while the world laughed. Astrid, 27, had become a teacher. She wrote books about prairie survival for children, illustrated with her own drawings. In one of them, a little girl named Ingrid saved her family by remembering her grandmother's tunnels. And Odin? Odin had died in 1891 at the age of 14. An old dog, by any measure. He had simply laid down one afternoon in his favorite spot by the tunnel entrance, closed his eyes, and stopped breathing. Ingrid had buried him there, at the threshold between the world above and the world below. The gravestone read, Odin, 1877 to 1891. Faithful friend, he guarded the door for 14 winters.